Well, I've been bitten by the coronavirus bug, so it's been a little over a year, so I may as well pick back up. I hadn't made any progress on this, so don't worry, no skipping. But here we go. Forgive the voice. I'm kind of still dealing with a little bit of this. So this is chapter 11 of Dark Horse. Cresting the snowy linen, half grapefruits nestled in the ice of silver-rimmed glass bowls. Hammered, warming lids covered the scrambled eggs. Butter oozed from the English muffins, and wisps of steam toiled off the coffee cups. Eddie grinned at Pete Stackpole across the breakfast table the room service waiter had wheeled into the suite. "If we can't go first class, we won't go, right, Pete?" Thursday, the 12th day before the election, was beginning with a touch of luxury, for even a people's candidate deserved occasional sybaritic respite from the rigors of the campaign trail. Eddie found his in the Netherland Hilton Hotel in Cincinnati after a rousing night speech to 6,000 people who cheered his fair shake doctrine as one worthy of trial at long last in the greatest egalitarian republic. He had visited with Kate Witherspoon for several hours in her room down the hall, had slept deeply, and was now ready and eager to carry the fray once again to the bastions of privilege. At the same time, Eddie was conscious of a tender glow unrelated to his anticipation for the battle. "Pete, how many times you really been involved with a woman?" "That's a hell of a question to ask at 7:30 in the morning." Pete scooped out a neatly severed segment of grapefruit. The phone, resting on the table at the end of the long, white extension cord, shrilled at Pete's elbow. He answered. "Stackpole." "Okay, I'll wait." He explained to Eddie. "For me. Bishop at the White House. It's got to be trouble." Russell Bishop had served as the president's hangman. His noose slipped over the necks of those who reviled presidential policy, misinterpreted orders, or merely said something that irked the chief executive. Bishop was a purulent little man, obsequious to those in favor of his poison and to those who were not. "Hello, Russell. That's all right. We've been up for half an hour now." Pete tapped a fork on the table as he listened. "Now, just a minute. You're blowing all that out of proportion." "Hell no, we're not going to apologize." "Okay, you do that. Who cares?" "Listen, Russell, that would come with a lot more grace if the president had endorsed Eddie. As it is, we don't owe him a goddamn thing. And you can quote that in full when you call in the press for your knifing act. One other thing. You tell the man that the next time he has something to say to us, he can call Commissioner Quinn in person." Pete crashed the receiver back on its cradle. "God, I'd like to give that guy a good kick in the ass." "What about Brazil?" asked Eddie. "Remember yesterday in Washington Courthouse you said something about chasing the special interests down to Brazil? Well, I guess the wire service has carried that story to Latin America. Last night the Brazilian ambassador complained to the White House. Bishop says the president wants you to apologize. You heard what I told him." "Why the hassle? Everybody knows the big con men used to take it on the lam to Brazil." "Of course, Eddie, it doesn't amount to piss in a hurricane. The White House just wants an excuse to slap you in public." "Forget it." "I already have." Nevertheless, the candidate and manager spent 5 minutes trading blackened views of various White House henchmen, thus recharging their spiritual batteries for a combative morning of motorcading to Indianapolis along Interstate 74. While they finished breakfast, Stackpole skimmed the front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer and read the two-column story about Eddie's speech and his Finn for Quinn appeal. "Eddie," asked Stackpole suddenly, "have you got something going on with Kate Witherspoon?" Eddie carefully set down his coffee cup. "What makes you ask that?" "Well, you asked me about affairs before breakfast, and the usual signs. The way she talks to you. Private smiles, very chummy stuff." "I like her, Pete. She's a smart one." "I'm not talking about her brain. Look, Eddie, it's your own business. I'm just interested, that's all." "Don't worry, Pete. I'm minding the big store." Descending in the elevator, pondering a weather forecast of rain and still simmering over the Bishop call, Stackpole had a premonition that this might be one of those days. The scene in the lobby confirmed his hunch. A dozen enraged journalists surrounded Phil Liccardo. Those who weren't shouting were talking simultaneously. The publicity chief, resplendent in a hot pink shirt that matched his rising color, struggled to maintain a calm that threatened to shatter any moment. Stackpole heard ricochets of the volley directed at Liccardo. Worst campaign lash-up since Adelaide in '56. Next time you say bags in the lobby at 6:30 a.m., we're going to lynch you. Why weren't you down to watch the goddamn operation? To Stackpole's trained ear, the abuse indicated that the press corps had been inconvenienced in some dark manner relating to luggage. Nothing so offends the sensibilities of campaigning journalists as a threat to personal comfort. Governments may totter, candidates face inglorious defeat, currencies tremble, and soup companies race frantically after vanished cans tainted by lethal botulin. But if the newspaperman finds himself properly housed, wined, dined, and transported, he will survey civilization's collapsing pillars with equanimity. What inspires him to a demonic theory of current events is having to sleep in a hotel sample room or being forced to lunch at a highway truck stop. Stackpole pieced the crisis together from several highly willing sources, including Sybil Jameson, the television celebrity who demanded that Liccardo either be fired or banished to the Soviet Union as an tourist guide. It seemed that the newsmen, by Liccardo's decree, had staggered down to the lobby with their luggage at 6:30 a.m. so that the bags could be stowed away in the buses preparatory to a smooth takeoff of the motorcade at 7:50. Having lost an hour of precious sleep, the Corps but recently discovered that the luggage had been loaded into the wrong vehicle, a monster bus chartered by a Buffalo chapter of the Eastern Star. Jammed with aggressively carefree matrons, this bus was en route south for visits to Abraham Lincoln's Kentucky birthplace and to Andy Jackson's Hermitage in Tennessee. A police squad car dispatched to overtake the vehicle had intercepted it in Covington, Kentucky, and led it back across the Ohio River Bridge to the hotel. The transport was now disgorging its innocently hijacked cargo. The Quinn caravan would be delayed a half hour unless, as Miss Jameson acidly pointed out, some Eastern Star satchels mistakenly found their way into a Quinn bus, in which case she would vote twice for Penholster. When Eddie's caravan finally rolled away from the hotel at 8:25 a.m., snappish tempers gave way to grousing. The muffled sky shed a steady drizzle, and radio weather reports predicted day-long rains throughout the Midwest. The cars and buses toiled slowly through Cincinnati streets, not alone because of slippery pavements, but because they promised police escort did not materialize. No one knew the reason, but all hands assumed that the mayor's unfettered support for Penholster had something to do with it. Then, no sooner did the motorcade hit Interstate 74 and start picking up speed than a taxicab sped by with a blaring horn and slowed down directly in front of the lead Secret Service car. Hands waved wildly from the windows of the cab. The caravan braked to a halt, and out of the taxi tumbled T.G. Churchill and a tall Viking, the communications expert on loan from the Bell system. T.G. ran through the rain with a flight bag over one shoulder and her macrame creation over the other. The specialist lurched behind, toting bags in each hand. They climbed aboard a staff car, and the motorcade moved off again. Later, word spread that T.G. and the Viking had overslept, although it was unclear whether they had accomplished the feat together or coincidentally. In the Buick Electra 225, Jim Flannery tuned the radio to an all-news station at Eddie's request as they sped through the wet, rolling hills of southern Indiana. The car's sleek interior was soon awash in the daily tides of world disaster. First came the depressing bulletins and chronicles from the yellow, black, white, and brown capitals of erring statecraft, then news of misfortunes along the home front. And from Washington, D.C., said the announcer, more politics. Hutchins Boyington III, Harvard anthropologist and a top advisor to Hugh Penholster, said in a speech last night that candidate Edward N. Quinn must be losing 10,000 brain cells an hour. This was an allusion to Quinn's press conference last week when the presidential aspirant said in presenting his human depletion allowance that human beings in middle age lose 10,000 brain cells a day. Boyington made the remark in criticizing Quinn's plan for ending tax deductions for charitable contributions, a plan Boyington said would destroy the nation's great private universities within a year and usher in a dark age for American higher education. Eddie grunted his displeasure. Boyington's an uptown con man. He knows damn well that when the tax rate goes way down after the loopholes are closed, a taxpayer can give his college just as much without it costing him any more. Stackpole's mind was not on economics. Boyington loves to kick a candidate who's not going anywhere. Makes him look good when the votes are in. Rain streaked the car windows as the radio sprayed more bad news. In New York, said the announcer, a coalition of black leaders today denounced candidate Quinn, terming his Fair Shake for All program a worse shake than ever for black people. The 15-member group rapped Quinn for his stand on busing, for his baby tax, for putting white ethnic groups ahead of blacks, Chicanos, and Puerto Ricans in his campaign priorities, and for false hopes aroused by Quinn in a speech on welfare last night in Cincinnati. Quinn told a Cincinnati audience that greatly reduced federal taxes would permit cities to raise more revenue locally and to lure industry back to the cities via tax benefits. He pledged to get the federal government out of the welfare business within 4 years, but admitted that as of now he did not know how to do it. And this report just in from Washington, D.C., the White House has apologized to the government of Brazil for candidate Eddie Quinn's remark yesterday that if elected he would chase that rich special interest gang down to Brazil where they belong. A White House spokesman said that offhand comments made by candidates in the heat of a presidential campaign rarely reflect the policy of the U.S. government, and that in this case the White House deeply regrets the aspersion. When asked if the U.S. was apologizing for the meaning of the remark or its grammar, the spokesman said the White House had no control over the syntax of presidential aspirants. Stackpole snorted. That's a snide crack. It had to be Bishop. Sounds like nobody loves us today, Pete. Eddie gazed through the misted windows at brown hillside fields where water gullied the furrows. After a time, Stackpole turned to the crossword puzzle in the morning paper, and Eddie began jotting in a notepad. Despite the rain, several hundred people turned out in umbrellas and raincoats to hear Quinn at the first stop, the small Indiana town of Batesville. Eddie, bareheaded and wearing a black slicker, led his troops from the caravan to the town square, which had been turned into a combination parking lot and shopping center. Liccardo and Finelli placed a portable lectern in front of a Kroger grocery store, and Eddie took his place facing the parking lot and across the street. The Batesville Roller Mills. Definite feeds for definite needs. To his right, at the First Bank and Trust Company, provided free information on temperature and time via a blinking sign. 42 degrees, 10:10 a.m. Lots of money in this town, whispered Liccardo in a last-minute briefing. Factories make household and hospital furniture for caskets. All your definite needs, cradle to grave, huh? Eddie griped at the lectern and pondered his opening. At that moment, 2 battered Volkswagen buses swerved into the parking area with a noisy thrashing of gears. Out poured a weird assortment of young people, the men with swampy hair and the women clad in varying styles from scissored crotch-length blue jeans to quilted skirts that swirled around their ankles. 2 men in headbands and pigtails were bare to the waist. Several women sloshed about barefooted and none wore brassieres. One at their common attribute their one common attribute was dirt. Their clothes were long unwashed and their faces unscrubbed. The newcomers carried plastic all-weather signs bearing such legends as "A Fend for Quinn," "Unisex tribes love Eddie," "Make love, not kids," "Help Eddie make America over," "Draft Grandpa," "Gays for Quinn," "Up the Pentagon," and "Satan, Jesus, and Quinn." The 24 tribesmen fanned along the fringes of the crowd and began shouting encouragement. "Give 'em hell, Eddie. Power to the people. Run the pigs out of Washington." Most of the crowd turned to watch the demonstrators. Some townspeople glowered at the newcomers, then looked questioningly at Eddie. A rumble of disapproval swept through the rain-pelted gathering, and several sign carriers were jostled. Eddie noted that the Volkswagen buses bore Pennsylvania license plates. "Those hippies with you?" asked an elderly man in front of Eddie. Eddie shook his head. He fumbled for an opening line, then shouted, "People of Batesburg." He could feel the sting of rain on his face. Jim Flannery at his side whispered, "Batesville." "Good people of Batesville," said Eddie quickly. "Pardon that slip. Blame it on this Pennsylvania weather they've sent over here to Indiana. We've got off to the wrong foot this morning, and I apologize not only for being 40 minutes late, but for demoting the good, progressive city of Batesville to a burg. I see that we have some young visitors with us this morning." The tribesmen waved their signs as if on cue. "Tell 'em why you love Eddie," one yelled. "I don't know who these young people are," said Eddie. "They're not traveling with us. However, this is the People's Crusade, aimed at a fair shake for all Americans, and we welcome everyone who wants to sweep the old establishment country club front office crowd out of their seats of power. And I mean everyone, young or old, man or woman, white or black, worker or dropout." He wanted to add clean or dirty, but let it pass. The intruders cheered, but only limp applause came from the Batesville citizenry. Eddie hurried through his pitch, compressing his now familiar litany of upper crust wickedness into less than 5 minutes. The townspeople listened attentively enough, but when the staff began to pass the hat, the tribesmen strafed Eddie's huckster patter with cacophonous appeals of their own. Worse, 3 unkempt characters joined the staff and wandered about holding out tin cups. One held a tambourine in one hand and the sign in the other. In the general confusion, which Eddie's spiel failed to dispel, the collection grossed only a few dollars. The crowd dissolved, people hurrying off to seek shelter from the rain. Stackpole joined Eddie. "It's a plant." "I know it." Eddie beckoned to T.G. Churchill. She was standing nearby, looking glumly at the 2 $1 bills she had collected. Raindrops trickled off her chin, and her long blonde hair hung like wet twine. "Look, T.G., we suspect these kids are a frame of some kind," said Eddie. They probably plan to tail us from now on. You hop a ride in one of their buses and find out the score. Then report to me at the next stop, okay?" "Right." T.G. handed her bills to Stackpole, then splashed off toward the Volkswagens. The gypsies were stowing their signs in racks atop the buses and clambering aboard. They ignored a cluster of newsmen attempting to question them. The motorcade, spraying water, moved back to Interstate 74 and rolled toward the next stop, Greensburg, 16 miles away. In the Electra 225, Stackpole and Eddie shed their raincoats. Stackpole sneezed, then cursed. "Greensburg, Greensburg," Eddie rehearsed. "Batesville, Greensburg." "For Christ's sake, don't do that, Eddie. You'll just get fouled up again." "Nope, I'll get it straight." "Stinking weather, Pete. What's your guess on those drag-ass kids?" "Bought and paid for. Only question is who did the buying for Pinholster. Not a bad ploy." Pete spoke with a touch of professional respect. "It's hard to disown somebody who says he's for you. They hexed us, but it's good in They hexed us, but good in Batesburg. God damn it, now you've got me saying Batesville. If we can't shake them, then they'll murder us right across Indiana. Explaining doesn't work when people see those oddballs waving their signs and cheering for me. Leave 'em to me. I'll handle it somehow. Jim, how about some more news? Let's hear what Pinholster's saying." Flannery again tuned in the all-news station, and the river of human misadventure, flowing as inexorably as a Congo or an Amazon, merged with the drizzle falling on the expressway and flowing rhythmically off the car's windshield wipers. "Here's an interesting item from Los Angeles," said the announcer in the bright tone affected by couriers of ill tidings. "A newly formed organization of lawyers named Concerned Attorneys for Pinholster has accused candidate Edward Quinn of gratuitously insulting a large segment of the legal profession. The committee, spearheaded by Douglas R. Whipple of the prominent Los Angeles firm of Whipple, Burnham, and Fogarty, contends that Quinn, in a Tuesday night speech in Cleveland, sought to humiliate thousands of hard-working members of the bar who are guilty of nothing more heinous than earning an honest living. Quinn told the Cleveland City Club that if his progressive income tax without any deductions, save a human depletion allowance, were enacted, it would unleash 100,000 tax lawyers from some kind of productive work. The implication that tax attorneys are parasites, said the committee, demeans a body of men who have made great contributions to society, not only professionally, but as citizens through a wide variety of civic and charitable organizations. End item. Let 'em talk, said Eddie. The fact is that if we had a simple revenue law, people wouldn't need tax lawyers. They could figure it out for themselves. You're telling me, said Pete. I spent enough time around state legislatures and Congress to know that every time a new tax bill passes, with all the whereases, ifs, ands, and buts, they create more work for 1,000 lawyers. I know what you mean, Mr. Stackpole, said Flannery from the front seat. When my mother-in-law died, she left us $6,000 or $7,000. The lawyers got a third of it before the case was settled. Hey, Jim, said Eddie, you a Quinn man? Sure am, Eddie. And I'll tell you something just between us. I talked to the pinholster detail last night, and all 6 of the regulars are voting for you. They say you may not have all the answers, but you're raising the right questions and laying them on the line. Add 6 Secret Service votes, said Stackpole, and subtract about 300 in Batesville. Who said what you lose on the merry-go-round you make up for on the Ferris wheel? It doesn't work out that way. They turned off an on-ramp and drove south to the town of Greensburg, where a weathered aspen grew quixotically out of the clock tower of the Decatur County Courthouse. An advance man had placed the portable lectern at the end of the courthouse's western steps. About 500 people stood beneath the dripping trees on the courthouse square as Eddie took his stand facing the Buy and Save discount store, Hunter Pharmacy, Holt House Furniture, and Meniere's, since 1865, clothing store. No sooner did Eddie uncork his oratory than the Volkswagen buses drove up. The motley crew, looking even more disheveled, leaped out, grabbed their signs, and fanned through the crowd, hoping, jigging, and chanting Eddie's praises. While Eddie fought to retain the attention of the citizenry, Stackpole conferred with T.G. near one of the Volkswagens parked on the other side of the square near Kirby's beauty salon. What's the story, T.G.? Pete sneezed again. The rain had slackened, but the temperature was dropping, and the dank air had a chill to it. All of Greensburg dripped. They're really nice kids, she said, and they're for Eddie, too, in their way. They have a commune near Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and yesterday some character who said he worked for Eddie asked them to join up and help Eddie out. So, how much is he paying them? I think it's $50 a day in expenses. I mean, $50 for all of them. Who's in charge? They don't exactly have a leader, but that brother over there seems to be the treasurer, sort of. She pointed to a young man who was standing by a Volkswagen bus, intent on repairing a sign which bore the legend, Draft Grandpa. He had a handsome profile, and his sandy hair was tied in a ponytail, frontiersman style. His chest was bared to the rain, save for a wooden peace symbol dangling by a leather thong from his neck. Pete walked over to him. Could I talk to you for a minute, son? I'm Pete Stackpole, Eddie's campaign manager. Sure, Pete. I'm Bill. He flooded Pete with insistent black eyes. His expression was as defenseless as air. Can we talk in your bus out of the rain? Bill nodded and led the way in. The interior smelled like decaying fungi. Boots, sweaters, candy wrappers, plastic bags, socks, and 2 guitars accounted for some of the award-winning litter. Bill swept away an oily rag and a sack of granola nature cereal to make room for Pete, then seated himself across the aisle. Pete opened. I take it you want Eddie Quinn to win. Yeah, Eddie's where it's at. We dig him. The deep black eyes concentrated on Pete. Well, Bill, you're smart enough to know you're not helping Eddie. I know you're people of integrity, and how do you know that, Pete? The voice was soft despite the abrupt interruption. The black eyes aimed directly at Pete's, blinking less, unwavering. Well, maybe I ought to say that I grant you integrity of purpose. The eyes bathed Pete in dark waters. You're a bullshitter, Pete. Stackpole looked away. The dark pools had a hypnotic quality. Pete reached into his pocket for a cigarette. You're also uptight, said Bill. You put out jagged vibes. Not bad, just jagged. Look, son, I'm not here for a sensitivity session. Pete welcomed the feel of his rising temper. It made him less uncomfortable. You say you want Eddie to win. I'm telling you that you're hurting him. People in towns like Batesville and Greensburg don't understand you and your friends. You want us to split? Bill asked it sadly. Yes, I do. Pete lit the cigarette. Whoever it was that asked you to join us wasn't connected with Eddie's campaign. You live in a commune somewhere? We're a family. Then I'd like to make a contribution. $200, and in return, you and the family break off and go home. And I thought Eddie meant what he said about a fair shake for everybody. Bill shook his head in sorrow, but the eyes remained steady, fixed on Stackpole. You're all the same. The system corrupts everyone in it. Eddie means what he says, but I'm his manager and I have to be practical. If you people keep dogging us, nobody's going to hear him. You people, huh? Kids, blacks, tribes, Chicanos, we're all just you people to you. Pete kept his silence. Nothing said, nothing lost. Through the misted windows, he could see T.G. chatting with one of the newsmen who had apparently tired of Eddie's oratory. Bill thought while he stared. How much did you say? 200. Okay, we'll split. Bill held out his hand. Pete stripped off 10 20s from his roll. Bill shoved the money carelessly into his front pocket of his jeans and stood up. Tell Eddie Forrest that there's no hope for the system. He did not sound distressed. A fair shake for everyone, huh? Well, we're somebody too. Outside the bus, Stackpole started to walk away, but Bill laid a hand on his sleeve and turned to him gently. Pete, do yourself a favor. Get it together. The black eyes drilled the target with a marksman's accuracy. Man, you're so tight, you rattle. Peace. They parted. The meeting was disintegrating. From Eddie's standpoint, it had been shambles. A local man had swung on one of the tribesmen during Eddie's indictment of the rich. The amplifier failed. The leaking sky dampened interest, and the collection grossed but $133.75. Eddie and Pete climbed back into the candidate's car, dripping wet over the upholstery. They settled back for a ride to the third stop, Shelbyville, on the way to Indianapolis. A man rapped on the window, and Eddie lowered it by touching a power button on the rear armrest. Jenkins, Indianapolis News, Mr. Quinn. He wore a pork pie rain hat, and his spectacles fogged in the drizzle. He handed Eddie a large folded sheet of paper. That's an ad we're running. The desk wants comment from you. Eddie unfolded the newspaper-sized sheet. Huge black type bellowed at him. A wild man is loose. Oscar Baker started the motor. See you in Shelbyville, said Eddie. I'll read it on the way. Eddie and Pete skimmed the advertisement as the motorcade rolled out of town and regained Interstate 74. The ad was a polemic accusing Eddie of political recklessness on 7 counts. Among other things, his plan to abolish all tax deductions would cripple hospitals, sound the death knell for private universities, and destroy the foundations devoted to the care and betterment of humanity. While removing municipal bonds from the tax-exempt status would bankrupt every major city in the nation. In actuality, Eddie's innocent chimera of tax equality would turn into a nightmare of depression and chaos. The sponsoring Committee for Political Sanity embraced 200 names, including disciples of both parties. It read like a roll call of the American establishment: surgeons, clergymen, conglomerate presidents, foundation heads, university chancellors, museum curators, publishers, attorneys, psychiatrists, foreign policy savants, importers, network executives, utility board chairmen, sports entrepreneurs, several labor union chiefs, and the owner of America's thoroughbred racing stable. A footnote said the ad would appear in 300 newspapers. That's $1 million ad campaign, said Stackpole. Somebody's hurting. It's all crap. Eddie was indignant. When the tax rates go down, people with dough will have more of it to give away. They're afraid of you, Eddie, said Pete. In this country, a politician can advocate race equality, political equality, sex equality, generation equality, you name it. But tax equality? Brother, on that track, you're dead. Rain washed out the Shelbyville, City of Progress, rally. The brooding overcast dumped water over the town, flooding gutters, steaming off the eaves, and driving all but a handful of inhabitants under roof. The caravan splashed to a halt on the main street, and Eddie ran under a green and white metal canopy and then into the Harrison cafeteria. Food you'll like, for a warming cup of coffee. Newsmen swarmed through the door and surrounded him. Dripping raincoats and damp hair failed to short a certain electricity in the air. Eddie sensed more trouble. A dozen reporters spoke at once, and Eddie caught the words pot and marijuana. "Hold it," he commanded. "One at a time, please." "Read it to him, Hank," someone shouted. Okay. A tall, slope-shouldered journalist opened his notebook. "I took this off the air coming into town. It's datelined Greensburg." A campaign advisor to Edward N. Quinn today advocated establishment of a nationwide chain of government dispensaries to distribute free marijuana to uptight, middle-aged, and elderly Americans. Thelma Gower Churchill, 24-year-old liaison between candidate Quinn and youth groups and a defector from Governor Hugh Penholster's campaign staff, disclosed her views in an exclusive UPI interview. Miss Churchill, who said she smoked marijuana occasionally, urged relaxation of laws against possession of the drug and said the federal government ought to give it free to anyone over 50, the same age group that candidate Quinn proposes to draft for military service. "Grass is a peaceful thing," she said. "We'd have less violence and turmoil in the world if men who run it could learn to relax and love one another like many of the young people do." The interview developed when a reporter overheard Miss Churchill talking with members of a group of hippies who joined the Quinn entourage in Indiana this morning. The hippies who support Quinn left suddenly following the candidate's speech in Greensburg. "What about it, Eddie?" someone called. "Do you endorse T.G.'s plan?" "What do you think?" he snapped. "I think it makes sense," said Sybil Jameson with a bridal little smile. "After all, if you're going to take men over 50 into the Army, you might as well fix it so they won't feel a thing." Eddie leaned across the steam table and said, "Thanks, honey," to the red-haired waitress who handed him a steaming cup of coffee. He settled at a table near a sign which urged, "Enjoy another cup of coffee, free." He spooned up some of the hot liquid and blew long and deliberately on it before swallowing. By the time he swung around to face the pack, he had gotten his thoughts in order. "You know, one time when I was a young guy driving a van for an interstate moving outfit," he said, "my crew cracked this lady's big mirror during a household job over to Altoona. She started crying. I guess it was some family heirloom, and I felt sorry for her. I said the company ought to give her the whole job free on account of busting the mirror. Well, it seems she wrote to the home office quoting what I said, and about a month later I get a call from the president of the outfit, no less. After chewing me out, he said, 'Quinn, if you want my job, you hustle and try to take it away from me. In the meantime, nobody speaks for this goddamn outfit except me.'" Eddie blew a long, whistling steam over his coffee and took another swallow. "Meaning that Miss Churchill doesn't speak for you?" asked the tall reporter. "Nobody does except me. Now, of course, I do not favor the government handing out free dope to anybody under or over 50, and I don't favor giving away booze, tranquilizers, or tobacco either. If people want to dose themselves, that's their business, so long as they pay for it and don't mess up other people. As for me, I don't smoke, drink, or take drugs except maybe an aspirin when I have the flu. So don't go putting out some big story that makes me into a pothead. I got enough troubles." "Are you going to fire T.G.?" "No, this is a free country. People have a right to talk." Eddie paused, stirring his coffee. "Of course, I may have a little get-together with T.G. Tell her about that busted mirror, maybe." Eddie reached under his raincoat and withdrew the folded newspaper ad. He shook out the folds and held up the sheet. "Now, let's talk about something important," he said. "Mr. Jenkins of the Indianapolis News gave me this ad, which is about to run in 300 newspapers, costing the sponsors about $1 million. You men and women are all working people on pretty tight salaries, so look at those 200 names and ask yourself, why does a fella kick in $5 or $6 grand for an ad that calls me a wild man just because I say everybody ought to be treated alike under the tax laws? I'll tell you why. Because in this country, a candidate can come out for race equality, sex equality, political equality, in fact, every kind of fair treatment under the sun except one: equality under some of the tax laws. If he's for tax equality, the big guns of privilege, some of whom don't pay a nickel, a hundred at income tax time, will wheel up and start blasting him. So everyone who reads this ad ought to ask himself this question: what tax benefit that I don't rate is each one of those 200 men and women getting? I challenge all the members of this called Committee for Political Sanity to make public their tax returns and also list their tax-free municipal bonds. Then we can decide the name and maybe should be changed to the Committee for the Preservation of Special Tax Privilege Loopholes. Another thing, a lot of wheelers and dealers accuse me of running a Soak the Rich campaign. Well, what they've been running for years is a Soak the Little Guy system. The newspapermen scribbled busily while water dripped from their clothing and ran into puddles on the floor. Aren't you trying to set class against class? Asked a young harried reporter, peering out from under the rain hood. Eddie drained his coffee and rose from the table. Is that your question, or somebody tell you to ask it? Well, my publisher, I guess, told the desk I have to ask it. I thought so. How much do you make a week? $2.10. There's your answer. Son, you and I have been taking in the washing and ironing of the big boys for years and years. It's time we quit. Okay, let's hit the road to Indianapolis. We're running late and wet. Eddie strode to the door, his brown thatch of hair matted the autumn downpour, his face ruddy and moist and his broad shoulders thick, thrown back. Kate Witherspoon joined him. You get A for effort, Eddie, trying to detour that pot story. He hooked his arm through hers. She was wearing a belted white raincoat, floppy rain hat, and white boots. Come ride with me to Indianapolis, Kate. I need you around. On the sidewalk under the fluted metal canopy, they found T.G. counting dollar bills into Stackpole's outstretched palm. I collected $14 along the street anyway, she said. Please don't bawl me out, Eddie. Pete already laid it on me. It hurt, T.G. He threw his arm around her shoulders. And if I had a chance to win, I probably would have fired you. From now on, you let me do the talking, honey, okay? I promise. A drop of rain slid off her nose, but I still think it's a good idea. The motorcade splashed out of Shelbyville, heading across the damp midriff of Indiana and toward its uncertain destiny. Almost nothing went right during the long, chill, overcast, soggy day and night. About an hour and a half late for the big noon rally at Monument Circle in Indianapolis, Eddie missed the lunchtime crowds and spoke to a bedraggled gathering of not more than 3,000 people. Stackpole had counted on a minimum of 10,000 and hoped for 20,000. Heading west on Route 40, the Winworth Quinners bypassed a scheduled appearance in Plainsfield because of a slashing downpour. Detouring to DePaul University at Greencastle was another outdoor speech. Eddie found himself without rain for a change, but facing a brigade of hecklers who insisted on mining Eddie's views on marijuana, sex, and transcendental meditation. While Eddie's doctrine of an economic fair shake won mild approval, the students preferred to climb the ladder of values to such loftier rungs as sensory perception, alienation, and self-awareness. Also, Eddie lost several intellectual points when it became obvious that he thought Herman Hesse was the mayor of Greencastle. Gratefully, back on Route 40 under skies that wept only sporadically, Eddie spoke to a goodly crowd in the city of Brazil. The citizens applauded and opened their wallets, but no sooner did he finish than Eddie was summoned to a motel phone. The White House was calling. This time, Stackpole assured him it was the president. We had a time tracking you down, said the president after the quick frozen salutations. What town is this you're speaking from? Brazil, Indiana, Mr. President. I'd have thought you would have had enough of Brazil for 1 week. Now, Commissioner, I'm going to speak very bluntly to you. I've suffered without complaint through a good many of these outrageous statements you've been making as the nominee of my party, but I've reached the end of my patience. I think you should know what's just happened. The Russians broke off indefinitely our very promising talks about the Berlin Wall. That's bad news, Mr. President. Can you say why? I sure can. The president was furious. They quit the talks because of you. Me? What did I have to do with it? Your proposal last Friday, that preposterous business about limiting military service to men over 50, was made on the very day that Premier Ryabchekov was celebrating his own 50th birthday. Were you aware of that? No, sir. I'm sure you weren't, even though the Russian ambassador, as I understand it, dropped a broad hint for you. I don't remember any hint. Eddie stretched his memory. He just asked me if I knew what day it was and then went on talking. Whatever the facts, Premier Ryabchikov took your statement as a direct personal insult. While he didn't mention the incident in dropping the wall negotiations, we know that's the reason. Now, Commissioner, you may think it's a gas to go skylarking around the country saying anything that pops into your head, but I'm telling you, it's time to knock it off. Your comments on domestic issues are bad enough, but when you make rash sweeps into the area of foreign relations, you can do great damage to this country. Maybe the Russians were just looking for an excuse to quit the talks until after the election, said Eddie. If you want, I'm willing to call the Russian ambassador and explain. No. The word echoed like a volley of a drawn execution. Under no circumstances. I'm not going to be president much longer, but as long as I am, I'll handle the foreign affairs of the United States of America. Rolling swiftly off his tongue, the title seemed to belong to 5 or 6 nations at once. Yes, sir. It may be too much to ask you, Quinn, to quit talking like somebody hanging around a pool hall. Now, just a minute, Mr. President. Don't interrupt me, or the local drugstore, but my God, I insist that when you touch on any issue involving the rest of the world, that you start acting like a candidate for president, and not some kid running for head of the sophomore class. Is that all, Mr. President? Eddie's boiler gauge had shot as high as that as the man in the White House. No. One final thing. As a lawyer who has handled some complex tax matters in my day, I associate myself completely, if privately, with the statement made today by Doug Whipple's committee. And if Pete Stackpole is standing by your elbow, you can tell him for me that he is managing a goddamn national calamity. That's all. Goodbye. Good. But the click at the other end snuffed out the need for the final syllable. Eddie clenched his fists as he turned to Stackpole, who was indeed standing just outside the phone booth. Eddie stepped out and stood for a moment, breathing heavily and feeling his jaw muscles tremble. You look like Ted Witherspoon, said Pete. Did the man unload on you? Pete, the president wants me to tell you something for him. Eddie spaced his words with an elaborate mock care. You are managing a goddamn national calamity. Now let's you and the calamity get the hell out of town. Half an hour later, the caravan sloshed into Terre Haute, the day's western terminus, under cold and dripping skies. Stackpole was now swallowing pills to ward off a cold. Kate Witherspoon had begun to sneeze. Hump Jankowicz's torn, rheumatic shin protested the weather. R. Dan Finelli cursed his lost raincoat, and Sybil Jameson threatened to sue the Terre Haute House and the American Hotel Association for indignity to person, having to share a room in the Terre Haute House with an obscure female communicator whose talents had yet to grace a network show. Eddie barely survived a series of crises soon after shedding his waterlogged shoes in his hotel room. Margot Hicks, brooding over the black leaders as blast at Quinn, wanted to quit the staff and return to Atlanta, and only a half hour of pleading by Eddie, Kate, and Pete dissuaded her. Eddie's briefing on Terre Haute and its politics was conducted by a substitute, a young man from the mayor's office, because the scheduled briefer, the party's county chairman, announced several hours before Eddie arrived that he was switching to Pinholster. The evening television news specialized in shots of the larking tribesmen who looked even dirtier and eerier on film, demonstrating in Batesville and Greensburg. TG's plan for free pot in the pot-bellied ratted prime coverage, while Eddie's bombing of the 200 ad sponsors received only a footnote of attention. Then came word of a flooding of electrical connections in the basement of the hall where Eddie was to speak, forcing cancellation of the meeting. Phil Liccardo, investigating, could not determine which climate, meteorological or political, had sabotaged the rally. Eddie wound up speaking in the hotel lobby to several hundred people. Bathed by television light and cheered by a band of teenagers, he plodded doggedly through his pitch, cannonading the ramparts of privilege, smiting financiers that play on golf courses and squash courts, and pledging to cleave the Pentagon into manageable halves. One half of the Pentagon, he said, would be named the Department of Defense, and one half the Department of Offense. And in the Quinn regime, when and if 75% of the military budget would be spent on defense and only 25% on offense. Eddie said this division reflected his basic foreign policy, which, to quote my Uncle Hunk, means we're going to quit butting into people's business all over the world. To climax his day, Eddie developed a sore throat that he medicated with a steaming bath, a cup of hot tea, and an aspirin. He felt feverish, weary, and discouraged, and before he climbed into bed, he called Kate into her room. He called Kate in her room. "You sound kind of low, Eddie," she said after they chatted for a bit. "I am. I don't think I'm hacking it, Kate. Nobody's listening. And 11 more days to go." "Oh, you're not doing so bad. Even with the rain, I saw a dozen women flirting with you from the crowd today. Get a good sleep, Eddie." "Same to you, baby. I feel better just talking to you." As they hung up, Kate sneezed and Eddie coughed, and he wished the election were over that night.